And we'd like to welcome everyone to Dialogues on Gender Identity Part 2 today. And our presenters, will get a chance to talk with them a little bit. Today's call is primarily Dr. Jamison Green, who will be giving us a lot of background and historical perspectives on that. So we welcome you back. And I'm Pat Bailey, Director of Training here at Out and Equal. A couple of announcements. All right, thanks, Skylar. All right, so I think we're ready to go. And Jamison, I'm going to turn it over to you, so go ahead. And Jamison, I think you're still on mute.
I was still on mute. Okay, Pat, thank you very much. I need to warn everybody right up front, full disclosure, I'm struggling with asthma right now, so I may have to cough occasionally. I'll mute myself suddenly. It won't be that I've dropped the call or anything, and I'll be back as quickly as I can be. In this section, we're going to talk about how gender identity intersects with LGB workplace advocacy. And I really want to give you a grounding in some of the historical and socio-cultural aspects of the topic so that you have a better sense, of what you're talking about when you do start to address some of the more pragmatic workplace issues that we're going to get into in sessions 3 and 4. So I am Dr. Jamison Green. I have my own consulting firm that focuses on training and policy consulting around transgender issues. Sorry about that. I beg your pardon. I'm also a transgender health policy analyst with the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School. And I am additionally the president-elect of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today. We're going to review again the concept of transgender, which I know you got some good information about last week. We're going to talk about some of the historical interpretations of gender variant behavior, the medicalization of transgender people, the evolutions of communities that support transgender people, and then policy approaches, and I hope we'll have some good amount of time for Q&A, because I find that real discussion where you can get your questions answered in real time is one of the most valuable ways to learn about this material. So with respect to terminology, transgender is now what's called an umbrella term, which is intended to be inclusive of traditional gender experiences, or inclusive of many non-traditional gender experiences and expressions. The term was first articulated in professional journals in 1969 by Virginia Prince to describe her personal experience of gender. She was a male-bodied person living 24/7 as a woman without any desire to have transsexual surgery or to work in the sex trade, and who also did not identify as a transvestite because of the latter term's diagnostic connotation, which we'll get into in a little bit. Transgender was also being used concurrently by many other people of transgender or transsexual experience, typically to describe their experience of gender prior to availing themselves of transsexual treatment. The term transgenderist was used in the 1980s by non-trans people to describe female-presenting sex workers who had penises, or what was known in the sex trade as chicks with dicks. Virginia was a pioneer of support groups for heterosexual male cross-dressers in the 1960s and influenced discussions of feminism and femininity, as well as freedom from gender norms around the world. So transgender was explicated in the public realm the term shows up in many community-based publications, but it began to be explored in the early 1990s. And Holly Boswell, a trans woman in North Carolina, published an essay in 1991 in Chrysalis Quarterly, which was a community-based publication published by Dallas Denny, who's a famous writer on this topic in the community, exploring what Holly Boswell called the transgender alternative, which considered the medicalization of gender that transsexual people were forced to confront, and the artificiality and personality splitting inherent in traditional cross-dressing. In 1995, she reflected more deeply on the concept, writing, "The word transgender describes much more than crossing between the poles of masculinity and femininity. It more aptly refers to the transgressing of gender norms, or being freely gendered, or transcending gender altogether in order to become more fully human. To deny part of our humanity, the so-called masculine or feminine aspects, is to lock in and shut down a beautiful part of one's true self." So Leslie Feinberg's 1992 socialist political tract, Transgender Liberation, A Movement Whose Time Has Come, which is on the right in that picture above Leslie's name, and her 1994 novel, Stone Butch Blues, described a working-class economic struggle made necessary by poor gay and lesbian people's inability to conform to gender norms because of their appearance or because of the nature of their labor, and both concepts often facilitated the sex roles they wished to express. In the mid-1990s, the term was reinvented and popularized for political reasons to build solidarity with people who were oppressed or discriminated against because of their inability to conform to gender norms, which was often punished with expressions of homophobia. Since the mid-1990s, the term has been adopted by many, but certainly not by all, cross-dressing, transsexual, and other types of gender-variant individuals as an identity label. So a quick review of the terminology. Sex is a system of classification based on an examination of external genitalia and presumed reproductive capacity. There's a lot of science around this that we really do not know, that we do not understand. Science cannot tell us, medical science cannot tell us what it takes to be a 100% male or 100% female person. And this is something we can discuss later if you need to do that. But for now, I just want to quickly encapsulate these concepts. So gender is another system of classification that describes characteristics and behaviors that are assigned to bodies. Sexual orientation is a modern concept of attraction. Heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual are terms that refer to one's attraction to other individuals. Gender identity is a modern concept of internal relationship to one's gender, in relationships to one's sex. For example, male-bodied people are supposed to feel like men, but everybody has a gender identity, as you discussed last week, and many people's gender identity does not conform to the identified sex of their body. Transsexual is a medical term. It's a diagnostic term. It's used to describe people whose gender identity and or expression differs from their assigned sex at birth and who sought medical intervention to bring their sex into alignment with their gender. This has been adopted by many, but not all, people who have accessed medical technology as an identity label. And these are examples, what I'm showing on this slide, examples of how the terminology, excuse me a second. Sorry. So this slide shows some of the evolution, how the terminology has been used by medical professionals in discussing transsexual people. They started in the 1960s by calling transsexual people who were born in male bodies male transsexualists, and people who were born in female bodies female transsexualists. By the 1980s, that had sort of evolved to the notation of MTF and FTM, transsexual. Sometimes that would appear in journals with an arrow in place of the T. So the implication is that they went from a male body to a female body. In the 2000s, the community started to assert itself and insisted on having their gender identity recognized above the body. So, but to identify themselves as having gone through a medical transition, they call themselves trans woman, trans man, or trans people, trans person, trans people. In post-2010, we're getting to almost be able to talk about people as men and women and persons without necessarily focusing on the trans part of it. But there are times when transness really has to be discussed, and that's a lot of what we're going to get into. The terms trans woman, trans man, and trans person or trans people are sometimes used without the space between the modifier trans and the noun it modifies. And the ability to write about trans people as people without some kind of modification to describe their difference from non-trans or cisgender people is relatively rare, but it is increasingly common to see this definition only once, and then subsequently the lived gender is the one that is affirmed, even for genderqueer people, if their pronoun preference is known. So just a little bit about the cross-dressing versus transvestite. Cross-dressing is a popular term. Transvestite is the historical diagnostic term. It's a psychiatric term, and it's linked to paraphilic behaviors in the realm of psychiatry. And paraphilic means literally beside love, and it's a late 20th century, it's an early 20th century abstraction of the term deviant sexuality. And this category of behaviors is highly contested scientifically and politically, and behaviors typically associated with the concept of paraphilic are sexual arousal, fantasies, and preoccupation behaviors involving non-human objects, children or adolescents, the suffering or humiliation of oneself or one's partner, and persons of the same gender or sex, and non-consenting persons. So this is a very, very highly contested topic as people's sexuality is being judged by the psychiatric profession. And there's a long history of this, which we'll look at a bit of. But cisgender is a conceit rooted in the terminology of organic chemistry. The prefix cis, meaning the same in Latin, is opposite of the prefix trans, meaning across Latin. And by using this conceit, which really has nothing to do with gender, it's really an abstraction from organic chemistry, it expresses that the cis person's gender identity matches the social role expectations of the sex they were assigned at birth. A trans person's gender identity does not match the social role assigned to the sex that they were assigned at birth. And this is a very popular term with younger people and with academics. I find often that it stops conversation because it's so confusing, but I think it's important to let you know what it is and where it came from, because you may hear it, and you don't want it to stop you. So transition, another term that you'll hear frequently, is the period of time during which one changes one's gender expression and or physical body, and also the experience of the process. And one can transition in a way that's moving along a continuum, possibly toward a specific gender embodiment. There's a lot of resistance to the concept of binary gender, meaning that there's only one way to be, or actually two ways to be, one way to be on the masculine side and one way to be on the feminine side. And we know from real life experience that this is not exactly true. So there's a lot of resistance to using language that reifies that assumption. Queer, a historical term for unusual, once a code word for homosexual, later a pejorative, and now used widely as an identity label. Genderqueer, newer identity label, related to gender identity and or expression, and possibly sexual orientation. It's highly subjective and also very popular with young people. So here's a little quiz. I hope you were paying attention to the content in the previous slides. But I'm going to ask you if you can remember, when was the term transgender first published in professional journals?
And again, Jamison, this is Pat. For folks who are on the line, be sure that you click on the answer and then hit submit, and you'll get the chart there in the graph. And it looks like right now we've got about 75% of the audience says 1969, and about 25% are saying 1994. And it looks like we've got almost everybody in there. So it sounds like they were paying attention to you, Jamison.
That's great. Yeah, 1994 was Leslie Feinberg's book Stone Butch Blues. I actually am not, I'd have to go back and look at that text to see if she actually used the word transgender in it. And I should also say that Leslie has gone through a number of pronoun migrations, if you will, and I think now is mostly using either alternative pronoun systems or feminine pronouns.
And Jamison, you want to say something about what those alternate pronouns are, what that means?
One is there's a lot of different ways of approaching pronouns that erase the gender specificity that people are resisting about assumptions about how they should be as a male person or a female person. So people use the word they in all places where you would use any pronoun. And try that a little bit. It's really interesting. They also use alternatives like here, H-I-R, in place of either his or her. But a lot of these work better in writing than they do in speech, because it's sometimes hard to follow in speech. There's another system that's called AIR, where it's completely new words. And like AIR stands for, I think it stands for I. And then it moves forward. It's a complete grammatical shift. Right now in Sweden, it's been proposed that they use the word hen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's H-E-N. The E might sound a little different in Swedish. I'm not sure. In place of the two pronouns that are for her and him, or his or her, and I can't remember what those are in Swedish, but they're very similar. There's just one vowel difference. Excuse me.
We also have kind of the issues too of when you're changing pronouns in languages that, like Spanish that have the O and the A, you actually change the whole sentence structure too. So the impact of that becomes huge. And I know Jamison I think he's taking a moment to cough. So let's go ahead. Good. Let's go ahead on to our next poll question there. And you had mentioned this one too, is what kind of term is transgender? And is it subjective? Is it an umbrella, an identity label, or all the above? So again, look through that and submit your answers. And We've got about half the audience that has joined us on those. And it looks like right now 50%, I remember you said it was umbrella, 50%, but 50% of the audience also believes it's all of the above, so it's also subjective and an identity label.
That is correct.
So the correct answer is all the above. And then our third poll is, what is gender identity? And again, it's a deeply felt sense of self, code word for transgender, code word for transsexual, or code word for sexual orientation. So again, select your answer and hit submit on that. And it looks like we've got just about everybody in, and it looks like 100% is that deeply felt sense of self about being a man or a woman or somewhere in between on that, because you really haven't mentioned like by gender as another one of those terms that we've heard used before.
That's right. It's anywhere along a spectrum of gender.
All right, great. Well, we'll continue from there. Thanks, everybody, for participating in the polls.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about these cultural connections between LGB and T. And many cultures have different ways of viewing sexual orientation and gender historically and politically. From an anthropological point of view, every culture distinguishes between male and female in some way or another. In the latter half of the 20th century, for the most part, gay and lesbian communities were quite culturally distinct from one another, and bisexual people were regarded, and often still are, with considerable suspicion and even disdain. Transgender people have been viewed as interlopers, political hangers-on, movement invaders, and spoilers. But in truth, transgender people have long been associated with gay and lesbian communities because the violation of gender norms that they have in common often drew them together. But there's additional cultural connection with regard to gender and the notion of changing sex. So here's two pictures of Kuan Yin, the Chinese goddess of compassion and mercy. And Kuan Yin evolved over a period of centuries from male to female. And basically he started off as male and she ended up as female in both Chinese culture and Buddhist references as well. So there's a fascination that we have culturally with gender, as well as sexuality, of course. But gender really is one of the driving forces that connects all of these things. How do we relate to other people if we're not having sex with them? Gender is the big clue to that. Gender is the language that we use to speak to each other before we even speak to each other. Gender is our gender expression is how we tell people how we want to be perceived. And sometimes people have control over their gender expression and other times they don't. In many cultures, it is completely unthinkable for someone to express their gender, regardless of how they feel, differently than what is prescribed for them by their body. And in some cultures, even where it's less rigid in that respect, people read gender so much by external cues that they can't tell what sex a person is if a person puts on the opposite sex clothing. It's very, very interesting about how cultural assumptions work, and there's a lot of variation. But Tiresias is another example in Greek mythology and literature. He was very useful to authors of mythology, and lots of the plays, he appears in Sophocles and in Homer, in the Odyssey, and he lived as a woman for 7 years. He saw two snakes copulating, and I guess he stopped them doing that, and Hera, Zeus's wife, got angry, and she punished him by turning him into a woman. And so he later spoke with great authority about differences between males and females, and often got punished again for saying things that people didn't want to hear. So he's a very interesting character, but again, we wouldn't have something like this in our literature, in our historical, mythological history, without the need for such an exploration. So this is something that has been on people's minds forever. In real life, the ability to move between sexes has been more problematic. Are the people in these two photographs lesbians, gay men, cross-dressers? These photos were taken in Oakland, California in the 1880s. And we don't know how these people identified or whether they changed their identities to suit their surroundings. The language we've tried to use to describe and classify people who are different from what's understood as normal has changed and evolved over time, reflecting our sociocultural efforts to understand and explain sexuality and gender. In the late 1800s, we began to see the dawn of the modern era of LGBT culture. And Karl Ulrichs was really the first gay activist, and he campaigned in 1867 for the repeal of anti-homosexual laws. He was a German writer who studied law, theology, and history, and he worked to create a taxonomy to enable discussion of sex and gender variants, describing homosexual men as having female psyche in a male body, which is the language that was also used in the early 20th century to describe transsexual people. Once doctors began to work on transsexual people to transform their bodies in the 1920s and 30s, some people, both physicians and lay people, viewed this practice as a way to cure homosexuality. Therefore, it's no surprise that gay and lesbian people sometimes have some antipathy toward transsexual people. In the late 1800s, German psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who believed that sex for any reason other than procreation was a perversion, created a very popular book called Psychopathia Sexualis, in which he described strange sexual thoughts and behaviors that people reported to him. He classified these thoughts and behaviors into categories that were then used by the judiciary to classify criminals and by psychiatrists to classify disorders. And I suspect that this was the original source document for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders that classified homosexuality as a mental health disorder until 1973, and still contains a category called gender identity disorders today, although this will change somewhat this coming May when DSM-5 is released, and the nomenclature will become gender dysphoria. So Sigmund Freud, in his 1905 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, recommended that homosexuals be integrated into mainstream society. We forget how pervasive and long-standing the marginalization of queer people has been, since much of that history has actually been obliterated. And Havelock Ellis was a British physician and psychologist who wrote the first serious study of homosexuality called Sexual Inversion, which was published in 1897. He wasn't gay, but his wife had female lovers, and his observations of her behavior informed his thinking. The concept of inversion has long been one that is applied to the inclinations of transsexual people to change their bodies and live as the opposite sex, as if they are turning themselves inside out in order to do this. And the German physician and sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld was the most prominent advocate of homosexual emancipation in the early 20th century. He believed that science and scientific understanding of sexuality would lead to justice, to the social acceptance of sexual minorities. He founded his Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin in 1919. He contended that each human being is neither a man nor a woman, but is both at the same time, in unique and unrepeatable proportions. This theory is known as the doctrine of sexual intermediaries. Hirschfeld employed trans people in his institute, and he was involved in some of the first modern sex reassignment surgeries with his medical staff. His institute and his library were destroyed by the Nazis in 1933 while Hirschfeld was on a lecture tour. He saw footage of that destruction in a newsreel one evening when he went to the theater to relax. He never returned to Germany.
It looks like we've got another set of polls here. So just kind of reviewing, I mean, all these doctors were studying and doing research on this, but from the presentation that Jameson just did, whose idea was it that homosexual men had a female psyche? Go ahead and pick that one out there. And again, this helps to kind of have those discussions a little bit more. I'll go back here and hit submit. And it looks like, as we talk about this, it's interesting because for the most part, Jameson, I think you were saying that none of these individuals identified as transgender, and it was something that came to their awareness as they were doing the research.
Well, they didn't have a concept for transgender. Hirschfeld came closest to it, and he's actually credited with coining the term transvestite, and he did write in one of his papers, one of his early papers, about it's translated in two different ways: psychic transsexuals or transsexuals of the spirit, which he was trying desperately to find language that would really differentiate people who experience themselves not as men or women, but as possibly as the opposite sex or possibly as something in between.
Great. And
but he never used the word transsexual.
Oh, okay. Looks like our listeners agree that it's Ulrich, who was the one who had the concept of homosexual men had female psyches. So we got that right? Yeah,
and that's still, people will say that today. I am a man in a woman's body, or I'm a woman in a man's body. That's what Ulrich found the language to say.
Well, it's also that stereotype that, of course, a gay man's really a woman.
Right,
so
exactly.
That terminology and that stereotype causes a lot of problems and discussions.
Right. People think that all gay men want to be women and all lesbians want to be men.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's do another quiz here. And you mentioned there, what is that doctrine of sexual intermediaries? That sex outside of procreation is perverted. No one is entirely male or female. Loving one's own sex is inversion. And the soul can be opposite of the body, so how you feel inside can be different. So again, select the answers there for that sexual intermediaries. And it looks like we're going to have a combination of votes here. It looks like right now we've got about 75% no one is entirely male or female, and 20% the soul can be the opposite of the body. So, and our answer on that one, Jameson?
It is that no one is entirely male or female.
And you mentioned the soul, the spirit on that. Again, that wasn't necessarily sexual intermediaries, right?
That wasn't the theory of sexual intermediaries, no. Basically, the theory is that each human being is neither a man nor a woman, but is both at the same time in unique and unrepeatable proportions. So we all have to identify with whatever we think we are. Mm-hmm. So, and people who are gender conforming, that is, that they're in the modern terms, that their gender identity is in alignment with the sex that they were assigned at birth, we've come to a place where we don't have to think about that at all. And so the concept of gender identity is completely foreign.
Exactly.
But under Hirschfeld's doctrine, basically, he's asking people to realize that they are not 100% male or 100% female, even if that's how they feel. He's asking them to explore themselves and realize what components of masculinity and femininity they have.
Right, and I know I have a minor in psychology, and I never remember hearing these theories discussed or challenging people to think beyond those boxes of either or. So definitely
right.
The therapeutic side of the house also pushes for that theory not to exist.
Right, and again, back to the scientific stuff, we say that males are defined by having XY chromosomes and females by having XX chromosomes. And it's been known for decades, probably 50 years at this point, or at least 30 years, and it's a common fact in medical and urology textbooks, that 1 in 20,000 men has XX chromosomes. This doesn't mean he's gay. It doesn't mean he's trans. It means that he has XX chromosomes, and the only way they find out about it is through looking for infertility problems. So the Y chromosome doesn't make you a man. It probably enables you to have viable sperm, but no one has ever studied this enough to know. We don't know completely what the function of the Y chromosome is, and the X chromosome is so comprehensive and so busy. It influences so many factors in the body that we have barely begun to decode or to try to understand what has been decoded of the X through the Human Genome Project. It's really powerful stuff, and we have a lot of learning to do about these things that we take so much for granted.
Excellent. Sounds good. Okay, well, we'll jump off that pole and get back into the presentation then. Go ahead, Jameson.
Oh, yeah. I'm presenting, not just talking. Okay. So this actually is a graphic from the cover of the DVD, or not DVD, excuse me, I've forgotten what they are, VHS tapes, the videotape, and from the promos for the 1960s film, The Christine Jorgensen Story, which typifies, this graphic represents the typical average person's understanding of quote-unquote sex change. And people see it as the equivalent of walking into a medical clinic, as Jane Fonda and spinning around in a revolving door and popping out Robert Redford. And this was the popular concept for the latter half of the 20th century, and even into the 21st century. People will still say, when they first come into contact with this, that this is what they think happens, except for maybe they don't mention the revolving door. So Christine Jorgensen was America's first famous transsexual woman. But the first medically treated transsexual individual that we now know of in the U.S. was, changing the slide, come on, was Alan Hart, who was a Stanford-educated, female-bodied individual who managed to obtain a mastectomy and a hysterectomy in the early 1920s, and went on to become, he lived completely as a man for the rest of his life. I doubt that he ever took hormones, but he went on to practice medicine and became an important figure in the treatment of tuberculosis. And he was also an accomplished novelist. And no one knew about him until very recently. Going back a little bit in time, Lily Elbe was the first well-known European trans person. She was a Danish painter. I think her name was Einar Wagner before she transitioned. And Elbe had one of the earliest genital reconstruction procedures in 1930. There were some things done through the 20s, very rarely, but she had a really extensive procedure. And she died in 1931, probably as a result of a bacterial infection contracted as a result of the surgery. She's thought to have engineered her own publicity about her transition, whereas most transsexual people were encouraged to and did keep quiet about themselves. Michael Dillon, a member of the British peerage, while very much closeted as a trans person, published a book called Self, A Study in Ethics and Endocrinology in 1946, in which he posited that where the mind cannot be made to fit the body should be made to fit approximately, at any rate, to the mind, despite the prejudices of those who have not suffered these things, yet to suffer which they so readily condemn others. He argued for a physical basis for transsexualism, which could be alleviated with hormones and surgical sex reassignment. He was the first female-to-male trans person to undergo a phalloplasty, which was accomplished by the renowned Sir Harold Gillies in a series of 17 surgical procedures over 9 years. As a fifth-year medical student, he performed the illegal orchiectomy procedure on Roberta Cowell, there on the right, in 1951, after she had been taking high doses of estrogens for at least 2 years. While Michael was extremely closeted, Roberta enjoyed nearly 2 years of publicity across Europe, with photographers following her everywhere. Eventually she withdrew, and at this point, I haven't been able to find evidence of her death or ongoing existence. In any case, she did fade into obscurity. And Michael fled the threat of publicity only to die in a monastery in India where he had been accepted as a monk. And here, in her chronological order, so to speak, is Christine Jorgensen. This photo was taken shortly after her return to New York in 1952, following her early treatment in Denmark. She later went back to Denmark quietly for genital reconstruction, which she had not had when she got all the publicity. So with the discovery of hormones and the application of surgical procedures being publicized and institutionalized in the 1950s and 60s, the medicalization of transness really had taken hold. Doctors established criteria for patient evaluation and controlled access to procedures through rigid and often obtuse qualifying mechanisms. In the 1960s and 70s, there were about 40 centers for sex reassignment in the U.S., mostly at university hospitals, where interdisciplinary teams studied and treated transsexual people. In the late 1970s, an administrator at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Paul McHugh, managed to close the program down. Others quickly followed, leaving private providers as the only source of treatment for hundreds of desperate people. That's the hundreds of people who were willing to come forward. The standards of care for transsexualism were first issued in 1979 by a handful of physicians and surgeons and psychotherapists and psychiatrists who were concerned that trans people would become victims of unscrupulous providers who would take advantage of their desperation for treatment. They had formed an organization called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And the first 4 iterations of the Standards of Care, or SOC, were fairly spare in their provisions and almost seemed like they provided more protection for the surgeons who did not want to operate on people who would not have the resilience or determination to make their new lives work within a society that viewed them as mentally deranged freaks. Version 5 and 6 of the SOC provided more information for mental health providers to perform their functions in service to transsexual people and in cooperation with the surgeons. But versions 5 and 6 followed the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association fairly closely, and that tended to pathologize things. Version 7, the latest iteration, shown on the right above on your screen, basically is much more open and comprehensive concerning what services trans people might need, declares that gender variance is not pathological, that treatment should be individual and not everyone should be forced down the same treatment pathway, and transsexual, transgender, and gender nonconforming people deserve to have appropriate and competent medical care. The SOC historically have been problematic for trans people, but as more transgender people who are qualified professionals enter the fields of research and treatment, plus engage collegially with the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is what the Harry Benjamin Association changed its name to in 2006. That's a long sentence. Okay, so as engaging collegially with people in the association, we, I am the president-elect of the association, have been able to produce much more helpful standards. And the fact is that without such long-standing standards of care, we would not have the access to treatment that we do have now. We would be a lot farther away from access to even basic care than we are right now.
And it looks like we've got one more quiz here. Who was Christine Jorgensen? And America's first famous transsexual, 1950s movie star, a novelist, one author of the Standards of Care. So again, select your answer and hit submit there. And Jameson, do you see the Standards of Care evolving? I mean, as you look forward here, is it going to be one that continues to reflect?
Absolutely. I mean, the change from 6 to 7 is so dramatic, and yet I know that there are still a lot of areas where they can be improved, and there's still a lot of research needed. And one of the values of documents like this is that they highlight the places where research is necessary. And this is the case in every field where access to medical care is important. We've got two layers of aspects to access to medical care. One is for those people who do need transition-related treatment, but the other issue is that gender variance is so frightening for people that the report mentioned earlier, Injustice at Every Turn, also has statistics about transsexuals treatment in healthcare, or transgender people, treatment in healthcare, and 2% of trans people responding to that survey had been assaulted in doctors' offices. Mm-hmm. And we know very well from anecdotal stories that people are terrified to go to the doctor, that for fear of being criticized, assaulted, dismissed, disrespected, and often will exacerbate whatever health condition they have, whether it's bronchitis or a broken arm or whatever. Basically, they'll exacerbate the condition by avoiding care because they're so intimidated by the pervasive discrimination.
Hesitating to go in, yeah. And then I would assume that in countries where medical care is not as readily available, that becomes even a bigger problematic issue.
That's right. And I know Brad's in Canada, and in Canada things are much better, but still there are problems. I frequently hear of difficulties that trans people have in Canada, but you've got such much more progressive policies and political movement on this issue, and I know from having communicated with several of the governments, in provincial governments, that people are very, very willing to be helpful to other people, where what we see often in the States is officials, while we have some really excellent ones, we also have a few who will simply take it upon themselves to rather wish you were dead than give you the care you need.
Right, and I know we're going to cover transition plans and planning, and I know the standards of care are an important part of that in Part 4. So it looks like we've got 80% to say Christine Jorgensen was America's first famous transsexual, so we got that one right.
That is correct. I actually threw in that question about the movie star because of that photograph that I used there. She looks very much like a 1950s movie star in that picture.
She does, and I mentioned in the chat that I had just recently watched the movie and all the movie reels that they were showing. I mean, it was that kind of movie, Hollywood kind of production that was going on with a lot of that. So
yeah, But still, you know, the majority of people in this country have no idea who she is, in spite of all the publicity she got.
Exactly. So we've got about 20 minutes left, so we'll go into this last section. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah. So there is not one transgender community in the U.S. or around the world. There's an extremely wide variety of communities where transgender and transsexual people may be found. We tend to think of community as a physical location where smaller groups of people come together for mutual support and for commerce. But communities can take many forms, have many functions, purposes, and goals for their members. Historically, communities may have been based on belief in industry or occupation, as well as geography. And now, however, we're recognizing intersecting identities, and we may belong to multiple communities based on racial, ethnic, occupational, religious, economic, familial, and geographic concerns. One thing we've got with us now is the proliferation of communities on the Internet. And for those who can't see the slide, it's a cartoon. This person is saying, "So I went and joined a virtual online community. They laughed at me in there too." So you just never know where you're going to find community, but there's a lot more opportunities and a lot of different ways to think about how we connect with each other now and how these intersecting communities across geographical boundaries and cultural boundaries actually affect the adaptation of language, the adaptation of, or not adaptation really, adoption of language. The adoption of the term transgender has actually been pretty invasive to a lot of cultures. And the first time I went to Germany in the mid-90s, they rejected, the trans people that I found there rejected the term transgender. They said it didn't make any sense to them. And in the late 90s when I went back, everybody was using it. So, you know, you just never know. But some people are saying that because of its Western European and North American historical origins, that it is tending to erase cultural differences around the world, and we'll look a little bit at some of these things. Transgender lives really are very, very different, and not all trans people are found making clear transitions in the workplace. Transgender people like these two, a very young trans girl and a genderqueer person, have many struggles ahead of them. So this is a picture of a film, another video box. Paris is Burning. This film, which was released in 1990, is really exciting. It's a vibrant and informative film, and it shows a very special kind of community that still exists in some urban settings. And I really recommend that you take a look at Paris is Burning to see another side of transgender life that escapes what we, the kinds of stereotypical workplace transition things that we are knowing about. So there are legal issues that affect our status of male or female, and or neither. And basically, occupational pathways, educational programming, reproductive options, marriage, treatment in hospital and other institutional settings, and treatment approaching and after death are all really problems that can be addressed through legal systems and political systems. But all of them, when trans people interact with all these systems, it results in trauma. And that trauma is as a result of difference, is reactivated on a daily basis in a variety of settings. And trans people are often expected to just get over it, particularly if they've been able to find a job or access any necessary medical treatment, as if these events will simply erase a lifetime of struggle, damage, and pain. It's important to realize that until real understanding and equality for trans people is achieved and practiced consistently, trans people will probably have occasion to react to their trauma, sometimes in ways that don't immediately make sense to others. So some of the paper trails that people have to deal with are listed on this slide. And I won't read that all because we're getting close, and I want to the end, and I want to allow. So the policy positions that we have used to approach these issues, much of this was discussed last week, but non-discrimination, I'm just going to do a quick overview. Non-discrimination, access to public accommodations, access to medically necessary treatment, and marriage statuses and relationship recognition. Those are the kinds of policy things, and also the veterans issues, which very, very important shift in access to care and in access to military service. Some people transition before or during military service. Some people who are veterans transition later and still need to access that veteran administration systems. So most of our issues don't appear similar on the surface for trans people versus lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. But many of the problems of social acceptance faced by transgender people are the same or equivalent to those faced by LGBT people. And you look at the policy positions, these are all things that people have had to struggle with if they're lesbian or gay as well. Less so a little bit the public accommodations, but that's where the concept of transgender and gender variance, gender identity and expression, you don't have to be a trans person to have trouble in a bathroom. If people perceive any kind of gender variance, too much femininity for a male-bodied person, too much masculinity for a female-bodied person, these policies focused on trans people can have a very positive effect. So with respect to policy, these two questions basically are what we need to look at, and it does have an effect on, well, I mean, it does relate back to LGB issues, because just as we ask who has the authority to regulate what kind of person we can love, we also need to ask who has the authority to declare, decide, or label another person's gender. And we'll continue to find these issues playing out in the workplace because that's where the varying elements of our society come together. As we confront these issues of personal autonomy and social responsibility, our workplaces will continue to be at the forefront of progress because of the business drivers represented and validated by equality and opportunity. So, Q&A.
Great, Jameson. And I know we've got Harper and Kyler and Ann, I think, still on the line. So I'm going to unmute them real quick here so
Great.
that you've got your lines available and you can have some questions. I did have one question. Looks like Kyler may have jumped off and headed for class. But I know we talked about the military aspect, and I know like back in '94 there began to be some protections available. And Harper, do you want to mention that if you're out there?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Hey, Harper, I was just talking about the military protections that were available.
Oh, yes. The law passed during the Clinton administration called USERRA, which it was, I won't spell out the acronym for you, but it creates some significant, although limited, protections specifically for folks who, particularly for folks who need to take time away from their jobs because related to their military service to allow them to return to their position. And it is another kind of, although slightly different kind of job non-discrimination law.
Excellent, excellent. And it's interesting because in talking the military aspect, the VA has actually been doing a pretty good job already talking and working with transgender veterans. That their sense is we have to treat the veteran wherever they are, and although they can't actually provide transition WPATH kind of support, they are at least including that in their records and working with folks who are transgender veterans.
Actually, there is new policy that has come out of WPATH that the VA is adopting short of surgery.
Yes,
They're
and
not,
the reason
not
that
yet
short of
providing,
surgery has to do with some very old regulations, which are
right.
which are quite arbitrary and will probably be one day in the future repealed. But right now they are stuck with this regulation from the 70s that says they can't cover or provide surgery related to transition.
Right. So we have to change that. But right now you can get mental health care and transition-related hormone care and better respect and integration of your trans status into your basic health care, although they are having to undergo a significant education program for people working in the VA clinics to understand that this is actually acceptable, possible, and that they can do it respectfully.
Discussions, right? That education piece is still a big part of that. And I guess as we're talking about that, I know that, again, traditionally, and we'll kind of talk about this in the next couple of weeks as well, but for both of you, we do go into that aspect that for all along when someone would come out in the workplace, the assumption that management and HR would make is they're going to go through the WPATH process, transition, and on the other end would go back to that, duality of only one option or the other. And yet we're hearing more and more discussions about gender fluid, transgender individuals who don't want to go by the WPATH standards. And again,
don't wait. I have to stop you because the WPATH standards don't say everyone goes from male to female or female to male. The WPATH standards are very, very broad and inclusive of all kinds of gender variation. So be careful about casting these things as this is the one rigid alternative and then there's really much more. That's not true.
So how do we talk to companies about that? How do we tell them how they handle someone who's gender fluid, let's say?
Well, that we're going to discuss in weeks 3 and 4.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but it's complicated. No, it's if one read the standards of care, and I would recommend that HR people responsible for these kinds of, for being a trans champion in an organization really should read the standards of care because it gives you great background and talks about these kinds of variations and helps you feel more comfortable with all of the variation. And then you come face to face with someone who has an expression that may be different than what you would expect, you can have a grounding to work with them and to understand that they're really okay. It's really okay to do this, and it's okay to go back. There used to be ideas in the policies statements that were written saying, and this is true in some insurance policies where they do include transition-related treatment, they'll say you can only do it once.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you had to go back for some medical or extremely important social reason, you weren't allowed to. And that simply is not acceptable under the WPATH standards.
For the medical care, yeah, I know I've had several friends who have been allergic to testosterone, for example.
Right,
and have
exactly.
had to stop that. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I haven't had any questions come in from the folks on the presentation, so if you want to take that chance, you can chat those in now. But thinking about where we are historically, again, we've talked a lot about a lot of U.S. kind of folks. We've had a few international in there. But what else is kind of happening internationally?
Well, one thing is that some governments are making provisions in their identity documents for male, female, or other. I know Nepal is one where they use M, F, or X. Some people feel that other is a more comprehensive categorical label. And I know they do this in Australia and New Zealand and of course Nepal. And people are pushing for it in a lot of cultures where third gender expression has a cultural space. There's still a lot of prejudice, and some of that prejudice has been adopted from colonial Britain. This is actually the British occupation of India was absolutely devastating to the Hijra culture there, and the European invasion of America actually had devastating effects on gender variant people throughout the native cultures as well.
All right. So we're saying that. And besides WPATH, what other international organizations are working on these issues? I mean, I know that there's a lot of LGBT focus on the decriminalization of homosexuality, but what's happening internationally on that kind of legal front?
Well, let's see. In Britain, there's Press for Change, which is probably one of the most dynamic, it probably is the most dynamic legal organization in Europe. ILGA, the International Gay and Lesbian Association, actually has a pretty dynamic focus on trans issues. They've incorporated it pretty well, and they're looking at Africa and Polynesia and the Far East and South America as well. There are, in various countries, there are organizations that don't come from legal, they don't necessarily have legal people on their staff, but they are working very hard to partner with organizations that have legal experience and policy experience to move issues forward, specifically nonviolence, access to jobs, access to health care, and access to transition-related care as appropriate. So, and this is going on throughout Africa. One of the most dynamic organizations in Africa, in fact, is Gender Dynamics. They've been partnering well with other organizations on the continent, and the oppression of homosexuality there is so great that it's a little bit tricky for people to catch on to the gender piece. And with the HIV rates over there are staggering, and it's not just related to homosexuality there like we tend to think it is in the U.S. But that is probably, they've got so many social issues. Rape is utterly pervasive. There's genocide going on in various countries. There's poverty, starvation. I mean, it's really, really bad. So sometimes gender seems a little subtle and a little less important than these other things that seem to affect more people. But I can tell you, once you really sink your teeth into this topic, you realize how many people it actually does affect, how we treat people with respect to their gender identity and expression. And I really think that if we can get hold of some of these things as a philosophical and policy, from a philosophical and policy standpoint, as well as scientific standpoints, then we can make progress in a lot of other issues, because it removes a lot of wasted energy spent oppressing people for something that's utterly ridiculous to spend that much energy oppressing.
That sounded like a great closing comment, Jameson. And since we're coming right up on the end, I want to go ahead and make sure we get folks back into the workspace and doing what they need to do there. And I wanted to thank you, Jameson, for your insights and history aspect. I always continue to learn more every time we do this. And so as we close out the call, we're going to do a short survey at the end, and then we'll be back with part 3 next week, looking at workplace gender identity advocacy in the workplace and what's to do next. Any questions, we'll be sending out this recording link, and I'll have all the presenters stay on, and we'll meet real quickly after this. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next week.